This week on STC, we'll be looking at World Password Day and what you need to do to make sure your passwords are secure. We'll be looking at the big Android update for May, and we'll also be looking at Apple versus Google and Microsoft Patch Tuesday coming next week.
Yeah, so let's start with World Password Day, get it out of the way. By the time you're watching this, we've recorded this and World Password Day is now a couple of days behind us. But as regular viewers will know, I'm something of an obsessive when it comes to passwords, or more to the point when it comes to getting rid of passwords. And that brings in very nicely a coordinated announcement by Apple, Google and Microsoft on World Password Day. And they've all committed to what they call an accelerated push towards passwordless authentication to their platforms and products, so to their operating systems, but in a cross-platform way, which is the really important bit here.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we have seen a really big push, especially from Microsoft and Google, publicly announcing that they want to reduce reliance on passwords and actually get rid of them completely, which is obviously the aim of FIDO. And then we've got things like security keys. We've got the YubiKey, which is a great tool. But how do we get kind of ordinary people into these things? Because they're actually quite complicated to use, aren't they? Especially security keys.
Yeah, but that's the vital thing here. It's the most important thing here, is that security, good security, for us to push forward with good security, it requires user acceptance. And that means that whatever you do needs to be as frictionless as possible. So it's the reason that people are annoyed with passwords in the first place, because they've got to remember so many, so they tend to only remember one and then use it across everything. And the one that they do remember tends to be weak, because that's the way that they can remember it, but they can't be bothered to use programs that will help with that. So the important thing here is that people are already used to Face ID on their iPhone. They're already used to Hello, Microsoft Hello for Windows. And they're already used to a message popping up on your phone with Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator, Google prompts for two-factor authentication. So what this is doing is bringing all of those things together, so that if you want to access a site or service, say you're using a Google Chrome browser on a Windows PC, you can get an authentication prompt instead of a password that will pop up on your iPhone and just say, is that you trying to access this site? And you just touch your screen. That's it. That's all you need to do. Then you don't need to worry about it anymore. It's done. So this cross-platform approach, and the fact that it's completely frictionless, because it's using our device that we've already got, that we're happy using, that we know how to use, be it a fingerprint scan or a face ID scan. We're happy doing that. And that makes it just completely easy to use. And that's the approach that we need to go for.
So if you look at the that kind of trusted device architecture, which we've talked about before, Apple does particularly well, in terms of, if you want to log on to a new device, it understands where you're already logged on and the rest of it. I mean, how far does this go? Because, this eradicates huge amounts of risk for people in terms of losing access or giving up access to devices, to platforms and the rest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the FIDO standards, alliance standards that they're using, essentially turns your mobile device into a secure passkey store, no matter what device you're using, what mobile device you're using. What you end up with is you get access to that key very easily, and it provides something you are, which is the biometric side, something you have, which is your phone, and something you know, which is the code, pressing OK, that's the code, your passcode, your passkey, all in one action. And you might think, oh, well, that doesn't sound very safe because everything's wrapped up in my phone. But I think it's the opposite. I think it's a less risky way to approach authentication, because a threat actor would need access to your device. So they'd need your phone physically, but they'd also need your face or fingerprints or a PIN number as well in order to gain access to that target site or service, which isn't impossible, obviously, but it's a whole lot safer than relying upon a password that you then share across multiple sites. And I think this is a huge, I mean, the really, really huge thing about this isn't that Microsoft, Apple, Google are doing this. It's that they're doing it together. So it's cross-platform, they're cooperating with each other, and it's that cross-platform cooperation that's really important here. This is actually going to move things forward.
There is risk, and it's by pushing the responsibility to the hardware manufacturers of this. And we saw this with Samsung a few years ago, where they'd screwed up with, I think, where you put a screen protector on a device and you could spoof the fingerprint reader. It is, you know, it's an interesting one, and we've seen clearly we're all relying much more particularly on Face ID for Apple Pay and all the rest of it. This whole device biometrics is interesting. The other thing, obviously, device biometric throws up is kind of the monopolistic ownership of all kinds of different services by the hardware manufacturers, the dominant hardware manufacturers. So whilst it's interesting, I think, you know, it isn't just a one-way street. I think it's something that we do need to look at in terms of where the right balance lies.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think all authentication poses a risk, however you do it. You just have to work out where the risk is greater and where the risk is less. And saying that, of course, this isn't something that's going to happen immediately anyway, even though these technologies are all there with each of the companies concerned. This coordinated cross-platform approach is going to take time to roll out. So I'd be surprised if we see this before the end of the year actually working properly. So in the meantime, World Password Day, we still need to deal with passwords anyway. So I'm just wondering, what are our tips for viewers? If we would just say one thing that would help with password authentication, mine would be use a password manager, because it solves the problem of creating and remembering strong passwords wherever you are. What about you guys?
So for me, I think it's twofold. Firstly, even though there's a lot of advice from us as much as anywhere else in terms of the risk with SMS, if SMS 2FA is the easiest thing for you to use, just use it and ignore the warnings, just use something. And then similarly, you know, as good as they are, password managers can be confusing for people. Things like Safari or your kind of your keychain on an Apple device will remember stuff. It's fine. Use whatever is easiest to use, but use something, because something is always better than nothing in this world.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that actually, because if you're looking out for kind of family members, I mean, you yourself might be more experienced and be using a password manager or something like Safari Keychain. But if you're looking out for maybe an older family member, someone who's not technically apt, so is that the right word? Yeah. I would suggest using a password book. There is absolutely nothing wrong with having a physical book with a set of unique passwords in there for you to use. Keep that book locked away in a drawer. Don't take it out with your laptop, because that would be a nice find for somebody who was to find that package. And yeah, that's an absolutely fine thing to do. Passwords themselves, try and make them longer and complex. And if you do need to remember them, another thing that I would suggest doing is using a passphrase. I know some people like them, some people don't, but the longer the password, the better. And if it's a passphrase, easier to remember.
So we've spoken about Apple, Google, Microsoft working together. I think you're taking a look at various companies not working together, aren't you, Kate?
Yeah, you could say that. So Android has always kind of fallen way behind Apple in terms of the privacy stakes. We know that, sometimes arguably in the security stakes as well. Apple's obviously introduced a lot of good privacy features in the last year or so, one being ATT, which is the biggest one, the one that's made the biggest difference. Another one was privacy labels. So when we go into the App Store, we can see the data that apps collect. And I know Zach wrote quite a few articles about this last year, which are really interesting, actually, looking at people like Google, how much data they collect in comparison to Apple Mail, for example. Google's introducing these in the App Store as well, in the Google Play Store. So when you go into Google Play, you can see what data the apps are collecting. And it is great. It is good to have that laid out there, but obviously way behind Apple. So at the same time, last week, Apple actually released a white paper. It was an Apple commissioned white paper, but it was by an academic. And it was about app tracking transparency, because Apple's been criticized quite heavily for app tracking transparency by some of the people who don't like it very much maybe because it might affect them like Facebook, who are saying that, well, Apple's got its own advertising business. Is it actually trying to bring out these features to hammer Facebook and Google in terms of advertising, and then actually build its own advertising business in the background? So yeah, quite a lot going on there.
It comes down to, we talked about it a lot before, it's all down to business models, isn't it? So you know, I have written a lot about, you know, just trying to understand where people make money. And what's been quite interesting is, obviously we're in results reporting season at the moment for big tech, and what is maybe most interesting of everything is how well Google's advertising data related revenues have held up compared to Facebook. And to my mind, it's because of its ownership of the actual platforms, whether it's Android or Chrome. These enormously popular platforms are a goldmine for Google, and has given it a level of resilience in its revenue line that Facebook can't possibly match, and has become much more susceptible to some of these changes. So I am immensely skeptical, if I'm honest, whenever Google does these things. I think it is clearly trying to tick a box. Apple has done a good job. Google comes along and says, yeah, we'll do that too. But then when you actually delve under the surface, it's like, okay, but how do you make your money, guys? And is that going to change?
Yeah, that's totally true. And Google's goes so much further, doesn't it? Like you mentioned, all the platforms, they've got Chrome, they've got Gmail, they've got Google Search, and combining all this data is an absolute goldmine to them. And then we've obviously got the cookies issue on the other side, and topics, and all of these kind of cookie replacement technologies that Google's trying to kind of push out at the same time, while still make money from advertising. So it's an interesting space, because we've got these three big tech companies kind of in competition with each other. But I guess at the same time, Apple and Google are really at the top there, given that Facebook's taken such a hammering recently. I mean, although its results showed that user numbers were starting to recover, the first results that came out at the beginning of this year are actually showing Facebook was seeing a decline in users as well. So where it's going to go this year, I don't know.
What I do know is that viewers are probably getting fed up with us saying so, but it's not going to stop the STC crew. Update all the things. And this week, that's two things in particular, which is Android devices, if you're an Android user, and Windows devices, if you're a Microsoft Windows user. So we'll start with Android. The May security update is rolling out now. It's just started. And I'm going to say, as soon as you get it, install it. Simple as that. Don't wait. And the reason for that is because there's a fairly nasty privilege escalation vulnerability in the kernel that both Google and the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, have confirmed is already being actively exploited. Not only already being actively exploited, but Google first disclosed this vulnerability back in January, and it's taken them until May to actually come up with a fix, a patch for it. So that threat window has been left open, wide open, for way too long. So when you get it, update it, install it straight away. And then next, we've got Patch Tuesday. The honest truth is we don't know what's going to be in Patch Tuesday. I can't tell you what the vulnerabilities are going to be. What I can tell you with a high degree of confidence is there's going to be a shit ton of them. Simple as that. There's going to be loads, because there always is. And the funny thing here with Patch Tuesday is, well, it's not funny actually, is that I would recommend that consumers don't delay their installation. Just get on with it, update it as soon as you get it. Because any risk of bugs impacting performance is outweighed by the risk of threat actors exploiting those vulnerabilities that are being patched. But it's not so clear-cut when it comes to business users. And one of the reasons for this, one of the difficulties that we have, is that Microsoft doesn't use the common vulnerabilities and exposures, CVE, severity ratings. They use their own severity ratings. Now, I'm not saying that this is to make vulnerabilities look less serious, but that is the outcome. A lot of the times they'll say something's important, for example, when the CVE severity rating is high or critical. So if you're a business, you need to go and search out those CVEs, the proper severity ratings look to see what they are, and then you can prioritize your upgrades, your patching accordingly.
I guess the clear advice is if you don't want to suffer the risk of getting hacked on a Windows PC, get a Mac, right?
If only.